Hello and welcome to another tutorial. So this time we are going to be taking a look at extending and improving the weather system that built before a bit. So what we previously had set up, we were able to adjust sliders, and that would control things like a rain effect or a hail or snow and fog. And so I was able to control each of those independently. So what I want to set up now is being able to have presets. And so you can have a preset for, it could be like a light storm or a heavy storm. And then you can tell the weather manager, hey, switch to this preset over this time, and it can switch to it. And also that while it's in that preset, we can get a bit of fluctuation and variation. So that's something that we can have happening there, which will be great. So let's dive on in. So where I want to begin is I want to actually start by setting up the data structure for the essentially the weather preset that can be played. So I'm going to create a script that I'm going to call weather preset. And I'm going to make this a scriptable object. This is the kind of thing that I think scriptable objects work really well for. It also means that we're then well set up if we want to add in additional things later on. So I'm going to change this so it's a scriptable object. We need to then add in the create asset menu. So I'm just going to place this under weather and preset. And then we can say the file name is a weather preset. So there's a few different aspects that we want to be able to control with this. We want to be able to control things like the intensity. So for each of the different types of things, we're going to have for example, a rain intensity. And I'm going to mark this as being a range from 0 to 1. And we'll default that to 0. So we want for rain, hail, snow, and fog, each one of those. So that's good. We'd have those settings. The other thing we then want to be able to control is their variation. So this is something where we'd start to add this in, we'd end up with a lot of different variables here that have got very similar names. So what I can do to make this a bit easier to work with is I could set up a class, and so for the individual aspects of the weather, we could have the particular settings. So weather element config, and I could have a range 0 to 1F, public float intensity. And then what I could do here is this actually becomes public weather element config rain. So it means our interfaces for accessing the stuff become a lot sort of cleaner and neater. We'll be able to do things like rain.intensity, snow.intensity, means we're working with stuff in a fairly similar way. The one thing we need to make sure of is this class here, we have to say that that is system.serializable. So this is going to make it a lot easier for us adding in additional things. We can keep it so the names are similar. We don't end up with variable names that are ridiculously long that can be really a huge hassle to work with. So we've got the intensity. Then in terms of how it varies. So the variation, we could have it be random and a particular amount that it could do either side. So what I find often works is we could set this to be a range from -1F to 1F, public float, fluctuation, amount. So that's how much either side of its current value it can change. Then we could have, this wouldn't actually be a range, have a min fluctuation interval and a max fluctuation interval. So the idea being that we will pick a new random value around that intensity, and then we move towards that over time. And then what we can do is when we hit that, we then pick another one. So it's going to make it a bit easier for working with. So that looks pretty good in terms of the presets there. So I can set up just a couple of ones. So I would create a folder that I usually call data. And under that, I'm going to create a weather preset. So we'd have weather, clear skies, which is exactly what we've already got here. We would just keep everything at 0, there's no fluctuation, intervals, everything like that stay the same. We could also then set up one that is light rain. So light rain might have an intensity of maybe 0.3. And the fluctuation amount, and that fluctuation amount actually should be 0 to 1f, because we would do plus or minus whatever the value there is. So I'm going to change that just so the range setting there is more accurate. So we might say that we only want it to vary a little bit. So it could maybe go up to 0.35 and down to 0.05, or we could maybe make that 0.1. Then it could go from 0.2 to 0.4, so we've got a reasonable range there. And maybe that fluctuation happens every sort of 10 to 30 seconds, that it's somewhere in that interval. So that's what we have for rain. We could bring in a tiny bit of fog. And the fog, we could leave that just at the current sort of setting there, because this would mean that it doesn't fluctuate, it's just sort of a fixed amount. We could also have an overall sort of scale that's being applied to everything. So I could set up down here just some overall fluctuations, because maybe we don't want the individual settings varying, maybe we want all of the settings varying. So we'll have a bit of a global control. So I'm going to set up one here that I'll just call overall. This will be individual effects. So, okay, that'll give us a decent set of ones there. And we'll key off the fact of if intensity is 0, then that means that effect is turned off. So that would work for light rain. Well, let's set up one where it is heavy rain. So with heavy rain, I might bump that rain intensity up to 0.7, and I might still allow it to have some fluctuation, but there can be then an overall fluctuation as well. And this might be over a much longer period. We'll have a higher level of fog that, again, we won't vary the fog, we'll just keep it where it currently is. And then I might chuck in just a light snow. So with that, we'll bring all of these back down, and the light snow have 0.3, a little bit more fog. And again, fluctuation of 0.1. So that's good. We've got a bunch of different controls there. So then what I want to be able to do is on the weather manager, tell it to transition to a particular effect. So I'm going to set up here header transition debug. So I'll make it a serialized field, perform transition. We'll have one that is our weather preset, target preset, and I'm going to put these all with a clear debug indicator, because this is our test interface essentially. It's debug of our target preset and debug transition time. Now I will set up so that these intensities and everything, I'm still going to have them visible, but they're going to get overridden by the actual presets that we use. So I will have default preset. So a weather preset, default weather. So, okay, we'll set up a couple of ones here. So we have what our default weather is going to be, which will default to clear skies. We'll say that the target preset is going to just be light rain, and it'll switch to it over 10 seconds. Because what I want to be able to do is an interface where we say, hey, switch to this we'll switch to this weather preset over this time period. So interface-wise, we're going to have public void change weather, and I want to give this a weather preset, new weather, and a transition time. So what we would do is in start, after everything's set up there, we would do change weather to our default weather with an immediate transition. So there's no delay for that transition. And then in update, I want to check, okay, well, if debug perform transition, then I want to do change weather to the debug target preset and that transition time. So I've got everything there for that, and we'll just set that Boolean to false, like that. So it's good. We've got set up so that we switch to a default weather. We can also transition over a time, which is good. Now we can start to get the things in place for this actually happening. So I will put down here, update weather transition, because that's going to be a thing that we have happening. So I'll have update weather transition. So I'm just setting this up at the same time because there's a lot of common variables we're going to need to have with this. So one of the things with this is I've got a lot of different bits of state information I need to keep track of for the rain, for fog, for hail, for snow. So much like how it was easier to set up a little class, it's going to be similar here, where it's going to be really helpful if I have something like a weather state, and make that class. And if I have in this, then stuff like, okay, well, what is my initial intensity? What is my target intensity? And we'll also put the current intensity there. So we'll have that. So, okay, we're keeping track of what our intensities are. We also are potentially going to need stuff there for controlling the fluctuations, things like that. So we would also likely need to be storing bits of info there for that, but we'll get to that once we get these up and running. So I know I'm going to need weather state, and we'll have state rain. So I'm just going to set up all of these so that I have these ready to go. So rain, hail, snow, and fog. So, okay, when we go to change the weather, one of the things we want to check is, well, if we've currently got no weather, so we need something to be keeping track of what is our current weather preset. So we're going to need weather preset, current weather, because that will make it possible for us to check and handle if there is no current weather, or if there is. So if current weather is not equal to null, there's going to be some stuff we need to do. Do we already have a weather active. If we don't, then it becomes pretty easy, or regardless actually at this point, because we can go current weather is equal to the new weather. Now the transition time matters, because if we don't have a transition time, so if the transition time is 0, we need to immediately snap to those new intensities. So what that means is we'll start at the baseline intensity and we'll go from there. So, okay, what I would want to be able to do is something like state rain, and it'd be really handy if I could do something where that is connecting to current weather and that rain information. So, okay, I could be setting something where we have switch to new preset, and we give it new weather dot rain, and we give it the transition time. And I actually think we might not need that, because I think if we have a lot of the logic be handled within the states, that will make it pretty easy for us. So we have fog, so rain, hail, snow, and fog. So we've told them to switch to a new preset. So that means we need a function here, public void, switch to new preset. We have the weather element config, and we have the transition time. So this matters because, okay, well, we need to pick our target intensity then. Now, this is something where we might already have been in a particular weather state. We might already be partially through transitioning. So first thing we would do is initial intensity is current. So transfer the previous intensity as our starting point. So that way then when we do our gradual transition, we're transitioning from where we were. Now, we don't need to update the current intensity, but we do update the target. So the target intensity, well, we've got our config and we have its intensity value. So we could just directly go to that. So that would be an option. The other thing we could do potentially is we could roll for what the target intensity should be. And that's something where I could set up, and I kind of like keeping stuff centered in the classes where it's actually the data's contained. So get random intensity, because then what this can do is, well, if intensity is less than or equal to 0, we just return 0. Otherwise, we return, and there will be a clamp between 0 and 1, of intensity plus a random range of minus fluctuation amount to fluctuation amount. Because this way, we get a nice easy way anytime here where I can go, okay, well, my target intensity, just give me a random one. Doesn't need to care about how it's generated, it just gets that. So then what I would be able to say, because I'm going to need to keep track in the weather state here of the transition progress. So let's say, okay, transition progress, which whenever we do a switch here, so we pick a new intensity. Whenever we do a switch, what we would do is, okay, well, transition progress. If transition time is greater than 0, then we reset that progress back to 0. Otherwise, it goes to 1. So that just gives us something where if the transition time, if we've provided 0 as it will be able to just immediately go to it, which will be great. Because this is going to end up with a tick, where what it would do is, okay, well, transition progress, we can update that. So transition progress, well, we need to actually know our transition time for this. So transition time, which I won't actually set those to 0 like that. It'll be initialized to it. So this would be where I would set transition time. I'd store that over. So transition progress would be that divided by our transition time. Now, if we gave a value of 0 here, that transition time could be 0, which would then mean this would cause problems. So that is a thing we're going to need to fix, and we will get to that in a moment. What I would do is the current intensity is a mathflop from initial to to target based on that progress. So we've got that happening, which is good. And what I would check here is if transition progress is less than 1, then I could go and update this. So if it is less than 1, then we update it, because the only time transition time is ever at, or transition progress, the only time this would cause an issue is if that was 0, which if that is 0, then the progress is automatically set to 1. So that should handle that scenario safely. And then what we would do is, okay, well, if transition progress greater than or equal to 1, then I need to update stuff. I need to, again, go, well, initial intensity is our current. I need to pick a new target intensity. So it would actually be really helpful to keep track here of that config. And so I'm going to actually store that config here as well. So config, store the config, set up the transition. So we're putting a lot of stuff in individual little classes, but it keeps the functions short, which keeps it more manageable and maintainable. So we need to update progress. Otherwise, we update intensity. And then we can check transition finished. So the initial intensity, we update. Target intensity, we go, hey, config, get a random intensity. And we need to reset our transition progress and to set the transition time, which we could go get next. We'll get transition time, which we make another function that we keep it be random. So we get public float, and this will just return a random range between those fluctuation intervals. So that's good. We've got something where it should continually be cycling and updating those intensities. So that means a lot of the stuff here is actually already going to then be working. Rain. So we tick that. So we just tick each of these states. Snow gets ticked. Also gets ticked. So we tick those. Then after ticking them, we can update the intensities, and we could even make it that the tick interface returns the intensity, just as a way of making it turn current intensity, makes it a little bit cleaner even again, because then we could do, well, rain intensity is equal to this, hail intensity, snow intensity and fog intensity. So really easy way of them being able to tick those things. So we switch them to different presets. So that looks pretty good. Can move these up to the top. So we can move these all the way up here. And what I'm expecting to see is that if I run it at the moment, clear skies, we should have nothing changing there at all, which is what we would expect. But if I tell it to perform a transition, I should start to see these change. So let's run it. Make sure we don't run into any bugs. Always a possibility. We have made a lot of changes. So, okay, let's tell it to perform a transition. So you can see rain and fog are ramping up. You can see our rain appearing. And it should go up to wherever the target intensity happens to be. And we can see it's continuing to vary because it is actually picking a new value to fluctuate between. And if I end up going and taking a look at what's happening when we go and tick like of the rain, we should see that transition progress is updating, intensity is changing, and we should be able to do this. So transition progress, we've got a couple of ones where it's infinity. So this is something where likely we do have a few ones where the intensities are 0. So the config, everything like that is 0. So that's something where if we have 0 transition time, we should actually just not even try and do anything further at that point. So if the value here, if what we got back was that the transition time was 0, then we should just actually not do anything further. So that's stuff where we could put in a couple of things for that. So we have a bool transition in progress is a false. Then here, well, what I would be able to do is once this has happened, we get our transition time. Transition in progress is only the case if transition time is greater than 0. And we could do a couple of other checks here. So it only tries to update this if transition is in progress. And we could actually put in a bit more of a shortcut where if there's not a transition in progress, then we just go, well, initial is current is target, and we just return that. So we literally do nothing. There's no transition, then do nothing. We probably don't need to go for that level of it. I think that would actually just be fine to return the current. So there's no transition, we just immediately exit out. So this is something where when we switch to a new preset, we can, and we do want to say that there is a transition in progress, but this allows it to get to a point where it can then shut off and say, yep, there's no transitions actually happening. So then if I run it, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell it to start transitioning towards the rain, which you can see that running. Then I'm going to switch this over instead to snow and tell it to do that transition. We see fog is continuing to increase, rain is going down, and rain will end up going down to 0 and staying there, whereas the snow's building up. I could then switch if I wanted to heavy rain, and we'll see the rain will ramp right up, but snow will fade down, and we can see those visual effects changing there. But we'll get that sort of slow fluctuation happening over time. And we can check in again and make sure that these states are behaving happily. That is something we do want to keep an eye on. Make sure that we're not getting odd values coming back, which we're not. So in particular for things like the hail one where we're doing nothing with it, so transition in progress is false, so that's good. So that's behaving the way we wanted. So, okay, that's good. We've got the individual effects happening. What about that overall fluctuation? Because that was something that we had in here as well, was we have this overall fluctuation that's able to be happening. So that's, again, another thing that we need to track. And so similar to what was doing here, I could actually set something where we have public float. I might rename that to actually transition time. That one should be more a get fluctuation time. So do a similar thing here where we can get that random sort of fluctuation interval. And what I would do is when I transition weather, I would go, okay, well, new weather, get the fluctuation time. And I'm going to need to keep track of sort of previous, current, initial, similar to what I have for the weather state. And so what I can do is I would have a float, and this would be the initial fluctuation, which would be 0. We would have our current fluctuation, and we would have our target fluctuation. And we would also have our fluctuation time and a fluctuation progress. So a lot of similar things that we need to set up. So this can bring this over. We would set our initial to the current. We would work out our target. So new weather, get random fluctuation, which that's going to do similar to what we had for this. So we'll bring this down here. This will be getting a random fluctuation. Now, if that fluctuation amount is less than 0, we just return 0. Otherwise, it could be positive or negative, which is fine, because this is going to act as like a modifier on the intensities. So, okay. Set up for the fluctuation. So that's good. We've set our initial, we've set our target. In our weather transitions here, well, what we would have is if we need to know if we need to update the fluctuation progress. So we're going to need all fluctuation in progress. So that's going to be an important thing to check. So F, that's in progress, and fluctuation progress, similar to what we were doing with the others, plus time.delta time divided by that. If the fluctuation progress gets to greater than 1, then we would do similar thing to this of repicking. I'm going to change all of these to use current weather, just so it's nice and consistent. And we would again, same logic, we set this to 0, so we're restarting that transition. So it just gives us 2 layers of transitions that can be happening there, which can give a really good effect. Fluctuation finished. Start a new one. So fluctuation is in progress, then we'll do all of that. The current fluctuation, we actually just add in to all of these. So each one of these gets this added in. Now, to ensure that these aren't going to an invalid range, I could do a clamp 0, 1 on them just to make sure it's staying in the correct range. So is there a fluctuation? Now, whether fluctuation in progress gets set to true or not, it's going to be based upon is the fluctuation time greater than 0. Now, I would also say if that fluctuation time is, actually I'll put that down where it was, if that fluctuation time, if we don't have that in progress, I actually think the best thing we should be doing in that case is current is equal to initial equal to target is equal to 0. So if we've set up no global fluctuation, we just actually switch it off. No fluctuation happening, reset the modifiers. So it'll always be able to smoothly switch between those level of fluctuations we have. It's just going to be something where it's nicely sort of updating. And current is a lerp, initial to target based on the progress. So now we should have a global control over the intensity settings. So I'm going to bring these up here. And we'll be able to see how that looks. And what I'm going to do is, for now, just make that public so we can actually see it, because I think that will be really helpful to see. And what we'll do is we will pick heavy rain has a global fluctuation. So what we'll do is we'll switch to, firstly, the light rain. We'll switch to that. And then we're going to switch to the heavy rain. So current fluctuation is 0. But if I pick something like the heavy rain and switch to it, so current fluctuation is still 0. So this is one where we do want to then go and check, okay, did it actually properly set the stuff up? Should have. But we want to make sure. So initial is getting copied over, gets a random fluctuation. In this case, it's a negative value. Fluctuation time is correct. Progress looks good. So fluctuation in progress is set to true. And I had this the wrong way around. Single character bugs, so easy to have happen. So let's try that again. And what I should now see is I switch to light rain. It's transitioning to that. I switch to heavy rain. Can see it has a current fluctuation. So this will just act as a bit of a modifier on top of the weather. So it'll be something where I could turn off the individual fluctuations and rely on that global one. Because with the heavy rain, if I take it and change all these so they're at 0, we'll still actually get a variation happening when I switch to the heavy rain. So we're already going to light, switch to heavy. So in C, it'll seek towards the target one, but we've got the modifier that's going to be happening here that will actually lower it. So we can see it didn't hit the full amount because we've got that fluctuation that's causing it to lower. And then once it hits whatever its chosen target is, it will then pick a new one. So we'll likely see it change where it's seeking towards. So this gives us 2 layers of being able to have stuff fluctuate. You could have an overall global fluctuation for a preset, and then you can have micro fluctuations for individual ones, which can give you a lot of sort of really good variation there, and it means that you have that sort of, you can set up where you can have short interval and long interval fluctuations, which is really good. We can see now that fluctuation is changing again. And what we would also find is if I switched to light rain, the fluctuation goes to 0. because light rain doesn't have any fluctuation happening in it. So if I put this back, so we've now got a weather system where we can play essentially a preset and we give it a time and it will switch to that. And it can start immediately in one of the ones. So if I pick its default, rather than being clear skies, it might be light snow. It'll just immediately start in that particular preset, already jumped to a predefined intensity and with fluctuations already happening. So we can easily go and play a particular preset, and you could be, with how I've set it up, it's very easy to then add in additional things on top of this. So we've got rain, hail, and snow. This could be extended to other types of weather. So you could extend this to things like clouds, and by having these linked through common parameters like those overall intensities, you can get that variation with all of them happening. So you can have big scale variations for the entire preset and then smaller variations as well. So it gives us a fairly flexible system for just being able to queue up and play weather when we want. You could also add in curves for variation of the intensity. So if you wanted something where it's a bit more hand-drawn almost, or sort of manually set up of what those transitions look like, you could use animation curves and then play an animation curve for a particular weather pattern. So you could bake in your peaks and troughs there with that. Would be something you could also do with this. We've got a system that's fairly flexible for now being able to extend. Thanks, folks. Hope you found the video interesting and helpful. If you have, chuck in a like and subscribe. It really helps out. It's really appreciated. If you're looking for the code for the project, that code is available up on GitHub, and the link to that is in the description below. You can use the code for any of your own projects, commercial, non-commercial ones, you can be using it. If you are looking for, we've got a video archive that I set up, and that's in the description below. That's something where you can search for particular keywords, things like that, to find all of the videos. And every time a new video goes public, it gets then added into that archive. If you've got any questions, comments, chuck in a comment below. And if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, I do have a Patreon, and there is a link to that in the description below as well. But until next time, bye.